is the author of Iberia and Beyond, Hispanic Jews Between Cultures. He focuses on the development of communal institutions and political thought among Jews in early modern Italy, and we're going to hear now about the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe and beyond. Thank you very much and welcome.
You know, I always enjoy listening to the introductions because I never recognize the guy they're talking about. There's a wonderful Hasidic story. You know, the Hasidim is this kind of sect that grows up in Eastern Europe in the 18th century and has become part of the ultra-Orthodox world of the modern Jewish experience. But the Hasidim centered around the character of the rabbi, who is not called a rabbi, he's called a rebbe, which is Yiddish, but it's a special word. It is a, you know, what a rabbi is varies enormously from place to place and time to time, just as ministers or any religious figure changes from time to time. And so the rebbe is this figure who is endowed with absolutely astonishing psychological and spiritual and intuitive powers. And to a large extent, this populist movement is connected to this invention of this charismatic kind of leader. And one of the theories about Hasidism is that it's about charisma. And this isn't just a diversion. I just want to remind you that Hasidim, who are now seen as very backward and very anti-modern and so forth and so on, that movement is born exactly at the time that the Jewish Enlightenment is born. And so I want you to know that these things are happening, and that will be relevant. In any case, to finish my little story here about introductions, the story is that the Rebbe has fallen asleep in his chair, and the students are sitting around praising the Rebbe. And one says, our Rebbe is the most learned rabbi who ever was. He knows the entire Talmud by heart. And the second one says, our Rebbe knows how to pray. When he prays, angels come down and see him and worship with him. And the third one says, our Rebbe has the greatest insight into the human soul, and he can save people's souls. And suddenly the Rebbe opens one eye and says, and about my modesty, you say nothing? So it was a nice introduction. I'm sure it reflects somebody. Okay, now what I want to do, and look, I'm coming to you as an outsider, right? I don't know you. I've come in. I'm very pleased for the invitation. But I'm going to talk about my own concerns. But please, feel free to say to me, excuse me, could you bring that around to what we're interested with? But what I'm concerned with is the idea of the Enlightenment as a process that is then internalized by different groups. In other words, the Enlightenment becomes a debating field in which different groups have to argue about it. And to give you a sense of this, and just from a book that I recently read and that maybe some of you know, Orhan Pamuk's book, The Silent House, was recently translated into English. It's a little bit an older book, but it's an astonishing book, among other things, because of its characterization of the Turkish intellectual who wants to westernize his society and import European values into Turkish society and Western society. And he is absolutely an impotent individual. And I recommend the book to everybody who is interested in the phenomenon of enlightenment. And he spends his entire life trying to write an encyclopedia for the Turkish people. And in the end, his wife, after his death, throws the paper into this hundreds and hundreds of pages, throws it into the furnace to keep herself warm. Wow. Okay, so Some of you are nodding, so I assume you've read the book. But it is an extraordinary book, and I won't tell you the ending of it, which is its own problem.
Can you give us the title again?
The Silent House by Orhan Pamuk, right? And it's really relatively recent, and it's available as an audio book, you know. And if you go to Amazon and join Audible, you get your first Audible book for free. So this would be a good one. Okay, but I recommend it. It's a very depressing book, but as with all of his books, it goes into the culture of being religious or living in a religious society in a way that very few people are able to do, and I recommend it. Okay, so I want to give you one other example of Enlightenment or modernization. How long do I have? An hour plus. Okay. Oh, okay. So, you know, feel free to interrupt me at any point because it's disjointed. Well, I don't think it is disjointed, but anyway. But this is from a book. As one of my colleagues said, it's sort of old-fashioned, but it was a very popular book, and it's still on the list of books for comp exams for graduate students in American history. It's by a man named Lawrence Levine, and it's called Black Culture and Black Consciousness. And it's a pretty standard book in American history and Afro-American history. And he is describing, or he was trying to get at what the experience was like immediately after freedom and during the Civil War. And so this is on page 155, he describes as follows. On a December evening in 1862, Thomas Wentworth Higginson walked through his encampment, observing his black soldiers sitting before the campfires. This is the middle of the Civil War, right? Some smoked silently, some cleaned their guns, some sang or prayed, some told stories, and so forth. One group sat listening intently to words being spelled from a primer or a primer. You know, a spelling book.
Right.
This simple act, Higginson noted in his camp diary, was a feat, quote, which always commands all ears. They rightly recognizing a mighty spell, equal to the overthrowing of monarchs, in the magic assonance of cat, hat, pat, bat, and the rest of it. Their love of the spelling book is perfectly inexhaustible. They stumbling on by themselves, or the blind leading the blind, with the same pathetic patience which they carry into everything. And this Levine comments, along with spatial mobility, literacy was one of the chief symbols of the former slaves' new status. One of the manifest signs that they were no longer chattels. Now, I mention that because it will echo to you all of the associations that we all, I think, grew up with about literacy being the key. The immigrant in America whose child gets a library card and then is off and running. The people who have learned the new language and are off and running. That idea of being able to know language and control language and move from one language to another. That is at the heart of the myth that we teachers, and I assume many of you are teachers, yes? That we teachers tell ourselves that we are creating the world. We are giving these kids the chance to be part of the world. You know, all the debates about your zip code determines your future and how do we do education. I was talking to Ms. Coleman here, and she was telling me that she taught for many years in a private school, and we were talking about the difference and what's the difference between public schools and private schools. And basically, if I can summarize what she said, money, man. I mean, you know, there's more money, and so therefore, right? It's a privilege and things like that. And you know, we ask we ask for fairness, and we ask for all kinds of justice, and we complain about the quality of our schools, and of course we have built this mythological meritocracy system that says if you go to that school you are a superior human being, which, believe me, is bullshit. But I apologize. I like to swear. No, I like to swear. I find it. I apologize if I offend people. I won't stop, but I just apologize. But one of our biggest problems in America, and Dr. Douglas presented me and mentioned that I got my degree from Harvard, and I can tell you that every day I hate that place more. Not because I didn't get a great education. I didn't go as an undergraduate. I went to the University of Toronto as an undergraduate, where I got a wonderful education. And I went to Harvard, and it was astonishing, and it was great. But I was a graduate student, and it's a different kind of thing. But from the first minute that an undergraduate walks in there, or to Yale, or to Cornell, or for that matter to any of the other baloney inflated elite schools, and this is true for the faculty as much as for the undergraduates, they are told, you are special, you are good. And the reason these schools have to sell that is because they cost a fortune. Illegitimately, there is no reason that we are charging $40,000 a year for kids in state schools and $100,000 a year in those private schools. There is no justification for it, except that banks wanted to make money from the student loan. And by the way, that is the crisis that is waiting for all of us. That is the crisis that is waiting for all of us, and it is purely created by the banks. So when you go to a nice university like Georgetown, and I think this is my second time on this campus, so I'm not criticizing Georgetown, I don't know anything. Or if you come to my university, the University of Maryland, which is a state school, or you go to any of the schools, if any of you have children who are about to enter college and they're going on this ridiculous around the country tour to find the best school, it's all baloney. And it is a crippling system for our schools and for our children. Okay? Enough, but we can come back to that. I'm not just ranting. I like to do my rant. But this is relevant because remember those black freed soldiers. It is all part of Kant's dream of what is an enlightened man. It is that idea which is associated at the heart of the Enlightenment, the association with education, which is very carefully defined, with being superior. Okay? And that is, and it is monetized, and it is weaponized, and everything else. Okay. Now, the Haskalah, I want to argue. Okay, let me go back here. Let me find my place. Okay, so we were talking about the Jewish Haskalah. The word Haskalah is a Hebrew term. It's a biblical term. I'll say something about what it actually means in a second, but it is roughly translatable as enlightenment. And we're looking at it in the European Enlightenment context. And as I say, please feel free to interrupt me. The point I want to make, though, is the word enlightenment, and even more so, the Hebrew term Haskalah, is both intransitive and transitive, in the sense that the enlightened man becomes enlightened, right? It is a process of internal self-development. We become a superior person, we become a learned person, but it's also a transitive term. The enlightener goes out to teach the masses, all right? And that balance, that two-sided element in that story was always implicit in the Enlightenment. It's never an image of a hermit who goes off into the desert and thinks about something and becomes himself for himself. That is never the point of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is always a process of internal development and teaching as well. One enlightens the other people. In that sense, on a political level, and I heard a little bit of the talk that preceded, it is both an inner or inward European project, right? In other words, Europe is discovering things, is feeling good about itself, is learning about the world around itself, is learning about the world inside itself. It is, of course, part of the project of nationalism. As Douglas was mentioning before in a conversation that I listened into, the lovely little book on imagined communities by Benedict Anderson. And of course, it's just a communist screed. Yeah, it is. It's an anti-nationalist book by a former communist who discovered that communism wasn't quite as noble as he thought it was. And but it's a wonderful book about how nations create memory and how they adopt memory and things like that. But the European project, and people now talk about the Enlightenment not as the Enlightenment, but if we're going to be politically correct, we call it the Enlightenment project or project. In Canada, we call it project, and here in the States, a project, right? But in other words, it had an agenda. The Enlightenment had an agenda. That agenda was inner European, right? In other words, it was taking all those peasants and making them more dignified and more urban and more liable or pliable to be workers in the factories or to speak the same language. Don't forget, in Europe, to this day, when you are in Italy, if you're in the south, you hear a different language than in the north. And in Italy, it is still an ideological question whether the south should not be thrown out of the country. Right? You thought the United States was the only country with the South that the North wouldn't like. Italy is. When you go to Germany, there are still areas in Germany that speak a German that no one else understands. Oh, yes. Right? In other words, that part of the Enlightenment was making language uniform. Right? In the United States, we did it in a very interesting way, not just by mass education, but by television. Right? Television made language uniform. One of the most interesting sociological phenomena in the United States, I came as a Canadian, and I came here, right? And one of the things that I was struck by is that since I came here back in when did I come here? In 70, 69, something like that, a long time ago, but African Americans speak a different English than they did. Let me say that again. Educated or university educated African Americans speak a different language now than they did then. Now, I'm not talking about Ebonics. Ebonics was another argument, and it's a complicated thing. I'm talking about the cadence of speech. I'm talking about the way you speak, the things. Now, there's nothing, that's a sociological phenomenon that's quite well established, and it occurs, and we all identify each other by the way we speak, right? And one of the things that I discovered, I want to give my students at a state school at the University of Maryland a book or an exercise that will make them aware of what the rules of educated speech are in the United States, and elite speech, okay? Now, obviously, I can teach them grammar, but that's a lost cause, right? I can teach them to put an apostrophe E where it belongs and to leave it out where it doesn't belong in it. So that's a lost cause, right? But I thought, well, there must be something about the way kids at private school, kids at elite schools speak that is different than the way kids at elite. So I started asking linguists, and not one person could tell me where to go for a study of that, because they are used to studying things like how do you take immigrant kids who don't speak English easily and make their English better, or how do you diffuse gender bias in the classroom. There are all kinds of legitimate concerns that are taught. But I asked, no, but tell me what are the signs. You remember England used to have an upper-crust accent, and now they've gotten rid of it because they're letting anybody on the BBC these days. But you used to speak you or not you. That was a symbol not just of enlightenment, but of class. And our students, I don't know about your students, but my students no longer understand what class is. They simply know we're all middle class. That's a word they use. So I went looking for those signs that define the language of upper class people in the United States. And I can't find it. If any of you have some ideas for where I can look, I would love to hear of it. But you had better believe that when Brett Kavanaugh was at Georgetown Prep, which is not this place, right? It's up the street, right? And doing whatever he did while he was drunk. He had a way of talking that legitimated him as a member of that group. And that's really interesting. Well, that was the Inner European Project of Enlightenment. It was a language program in a world that was divided into various things. And you can say, well, it's the nation state that's demanding it. And of course that's true. One of the things about Enlightenment is it is the product of the nation state. The nation state wanted uniformity. Empires did not need religious uniformity. Empires did not need linguistic uniformity. Nation states do because they are built on the idea that we are a group, and that group is defined by our common culture, which is dictated from the top back to the Enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen. Right? You see what, is this coming together? Yeah, okay. All right, so it is an inner European project, but it is also an outer directed project because it justifies conquest, right? When you go out and you meet those Indian peasants who somehow are just not quite up to, our standards, And when you go to Africa and those people, right? Or you go to Ceylon, or you go to the New World, or wherever you go, and you find people who are other. In the early years of world travel, the experience of meeting the other was overwhelming to the people who traveled because they were a tiny minority. Or if they were talented translators and multicultural types, what we call multicultural, they would go from one country to another and discover the beauty, and they would be able to move back and forth. If any of you know the work of Sanjay Subrahmanyam, he focuses in on, he started his work in India as an economic historian, but he's gone on to entangled histories and cultural exchange, and he talks about the idea that, we think of, well, when did the English discover India? Are you crazy? They didn't discover India. India was there. They just learned about it. They were ignorant dummies from some little dumb place. And by the way, their commerce, when they came to India, was totally irrelevant to the Indians. The Indians had a huge empire and a huge commercial network without the English. And the English bought a few little bits of tea or whatever they bought. Who cared? Right? And that's the astonishing thing. When we look at the chronicles of local places, the supposed events of European conquest or discovery are absolutely ignored. No one cared. But for the Europeans, it was very important, as they wanted control, to begin to define those people not as a superior culture or a developed culture that we are now encountering, but rather an inferior culture that we have the right to control, and we have the right to dominate, and we have the right to take its resources and things like that, all in the name of enlightenment and progress. And of course, the famous, I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the last thing, but Kant's famous essay about the Hottentots, this ridiculous essay about African culture and so forth and so on. And I recommend, if you're interested in it, there's a guy named Robert Bernasconi, who's a professor of philosophy at Penn State. And he has written a lot about European Enlightenment and its conceptions of race. But there's a thing I mentioned before. You can listen to books on tape. You can also listen to lectures online. There's a thing called the Backdoor Broadcasting Company, which of course is a play on BBC, right? You know, the thing. And what it is in England. There's a guy who started a business. I wish we had this in the United States. He's very good at it. And he goes around, universities hire him to record lectures, you know, guest lectures and things like that. And he does a really good job. Sometimes he actually has the PowerPoints, other times it's just the lecture. But they're wonderful. And he has about 50 or 60 of them a year of some of the best lectures you've ever heard. And you can find them online and so forth and so on. But if you go into his archive there, you will find this man, Robert Bernasconi, who he wrote a book called, an essay on the Hottentots as part of his thing. But he's got a wonderful lecture, and I recommend it. Last summary points here. This notion of enlightenment. All the time is running. Okay. It's important to understand that anthropology, that is the science of anthropology, which seeks to understand the essence of other cultures, right? And is part of this European project. And it was used to justify the aggressive form of the Enlightenment. And even globalized history and world history, if you go to the site of the World History Association, which is, to my knowledge, the only academic association which, by its constitution, requires high school teachers to be on its board, right? And are you on the board of the World History? Okay. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's part of this globalized history. You know, we used to teach Western Civ courses, now we teach world history. Has about as much effect as the old Western Civ courses did, but at least it's more larger in its attempt to cover absolutely everything in 13 weeks. As people involved in the world history movement and the whole attempt at globalization came to realize after a while the danger of global history, at least as it's practiced in the United States, is that it very often is simply a justification for American power, right? In the sense that you are studying all these other people, and it sounds like you're saying, well, we really believe in a much more multicultural universe. But in fact, you don't study those cultures from the inside. You study those cultures from the moment of contact, or from the point of contact. All of this leads me, and I'm going too fast, but I apologize. This is what we got. Jack Goody, famous writer, very important figure, who wrote a book called The Theft of History, in which he argued that as the West moved out with its enlightened idea of progress, its enlightened idea of content, what it did was it tried to steal other people's chronologies, right? And it tried to, and it did. There was a notion of modern and pre-modern. And modern had to do with being like the West, right? And that takes us back to Orhan Pamuk, and that takes us back to all of these ideas of enlightenment as being modern and progressive. Okay. Now, last comment about this that I want to challenge you with, and then I'll go through some stuff about the Jewish Enlightenment, one moment of it, and then come to a conclusion, hopefully, that'll make some sense. I would like to argue that the current debates, which are heard often about political correctness, and this is heard on both sides, right? Liberals say, oh, you can't say that. That's wrong, right? We need to be more sensitive, right? Nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly nice thing. But the term political correctness is a pejorative. When we say, oh, they're being politically correct, this is an argument that says you have replaced truth with politeness, with a lie. right? So when we say you have to be politically correct, what we are implying is, and therefore ignore the real facts of difference, right? You cannot point out that that person got into this place because that person was handicapped or a certain gender or a certain race or something like that. That would be improper, right? We have to be correct, right? And on the other hand, this same, we call it right-wing argument, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. This same argument that there were classics that are being abandoned. I went to a party recently where a man was telling me that his daughter was applying to school. She was in grade 11 doing that whole thing where she was going around and looking for schools, and he was hoping she'd go to BU at Boston University. And I said, why? And he said, at Boston University, they still teach the classics. Now, I have no idea why this man thought that they taught the classics at BU. They don't. But, I mean, it's not St. John's, right? We're not talking about great bookstores. It's not even Columbia, right? It's just a big school that just costs more than a state school. That's the only difference. But be that as it may be, right? That thing, I was talking to him, and he was telling me that he still remembered the great things about his education, how he had read Moby Dick. And I said, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's got to be the worst bloody book I've ever read.
It's a great book.
It's a terrible book. It's poorly written. It is
Boring.
It is boring as sin. It is poorly structured, because all of a sudden, 300 pages into the book, you have a bunch of people popping out of the hold who have been there the whole time, but they didn't notice them in this tiny little boat. And it's about a whale. I mean, you know, if that's the best symbol of evil that you can find, I mean, God, you know. And he was telling me this, and I said, it's a terrible book. I think it should be. And of course, nobody paid any attention to it until some idiot at some college in Massachusetts started praising it as the great American novel. And, you know, and so forth and so on. But my point is that what makes a classic is an act of appropriation by a class that is trying to defend itself. And this conversation with his father, you know, and these arguments, the political correctness, which we understand as a really ugly kind of a, you know, in the era of Trump, the kind of political ugliness of our society, or the use of classes, which is a more refined form of it. My point here is that all of these debates about what's going on is really a reflection of a fundamental problem that we have in our society. And it is the attempt to keep hold of the solid. And here, I quote one of my favorite rabbis, Karl Marx, who says in the Communist Manifesto, all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. He's describing the new bourgeois society. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an anxiety-producing moment. Now, let's take a look at, so we started with a belief in enlightenment, if, you know, literacy, and by the way, of course I am not saying that children should not learn how to read and write, right? God forbid, but we believed in literacy. I've then problematized, as we like to say, the term enlightenment by saying it's part of a project of the nation state, and in fact a project of outer directed conquest. And I suggest to you that our present ambiguity and our culture wars that are going on in our society are a reflection of the basic anxiety that the old verities including the belief in enlightenment, are melting. If Trump can be president, anyone can be president.
Yeah.
Right? It's just as simple as that, and I don't care what your politics are. If Trump can be president, anybody can be president. It means there are no criteria anymore for excellence or experience or anything else. Okay.
Money.
Huh? Money. Yeah, but he paid for it. But you know what? Other people, first of all, he never pays his own bills. And second of all, there are other people who have become superstars without his money, right? And he stole the money anyway. Okay. Caveats. Language, and to understand this, it's very important to mention. Language itself trips us up. Enlightenment is a function of language. Remember I said that it's all about making a uniform language, but enlightenment lives out of language. It is a game that is played with language. I want to remind you that language is not a very malleable tool. It is a tool that always is being tripped up by its own things. There is a game. It's very easy, and you probably had this in your classrooms with students, and so forth, especially if they're being honest. Remember that old thing, I'm rubber and you are glue. What you say about me bounces off me and sticks to you, right? Well, that game is a game that simply says, whatever you say, oh yeah, right? And we live in a political world in which that is done, right? There is no longer any relevance to the real world implications. It's just, if I can make the label stick to you, I win. Oh yeah, right? So language is limited in that sense, but it's limited in another sense. You remember a while ago we had the SARS and everybody was worried about, thing. So I was down at the Library of Congress one day doing my work, and I went into the bathroom. And the US government, in all its glory, had posted signs telling people to wash their hands. Sounds good, right? The sign, I have a picture of it, but I just didn't have time to find it and put it in the thing. The sign was this long. First, take both of your hands and rub them together to make sure there's no thing on it. Then turn on the tap. Then put your hand under the soap, hit it 3 times. Then put it under the water, rub them together, make sure you rub. And this sign is about 1.5 feet long on washing your hands, for heaven's sake. So, and there are many things like this. As a Jew, I can tell you that the law, the Jewish Halakha, the Jewish law, which is an elaborate system of ritual behavior. It's far more elaborate than the Sharia is in ritual terms, far more elaborate, because there's been hundreds and hundreds of people who have actually tried to write it down and make it clear. And so each little statement becomes more and more complicated. And this is how you wash your hands. And you have to start it this way. You have to do it this way. And it's insane, right? But that is a function of language. And law, by the way, is like that. And we hate law for exactly that reason. You ever hear a case where somebody gets off on a charge because there was a technicality in the law and it let them off or something like that? Well, that's because law can only function with exact definitions of what constitutes a crime, what constitutes not a crime, what constitutes, and so if you do it this way, and this language, it becomes part of the system of law. And it's insane because justice goes out the air, fairness goes out the window. But language is a limited tool, and I think it's very important. And I mention this to you if you have time, just because I want to give you things to do at night. Malcolm Gladwell is one of my favorites, and he's from the U of T, University of Toronto, so I didn't mention. But Malcolm Gladwell is a great writer, and he has a wonderful podcast called Revisionist History, and it's got great episodes in it, and he really produces them well. And you can, just go on Google and whatever, Revisionist History. So in the 4th series, number 4, he has one called Good Old Boys. And it's about an album that Randy Newman, he wrote, Toy Story, what's it called? Short People, and he, and Friends, and famous music composer and pianist and so forth and so on, and so forth and so on. But Malcolm Gladwell likes Randy Newman, and he liked his album, Good Old Boys. And so he goes to California to interview Randy Newman, where he's talking about this album and so forth and so on. And it's wonderful because he starts from this song, which is called, if I remember correctly, it's called Rednecks. Okay, and if any of you have ever heard it, the chorus in that song is, we're rednecks, and there's a line in it, and we run around keeping the N down. And he wrote this song. Now, he wrote the song, and I really recommend listening to the podcast, because he listened to Lester Maddox, the racist governor of Georgia, on the Dick Cavett show. It was a late night show. And he heard this horrifying encounter between, what was the name of the football player?
Jim Brown.
Jim Brown, right? I always mix up James Brown and Jim Brown. In any case, that was Lester Maddox's problem. But he couldn't remember which Brown he was talking to. But Jim Brown and Lester Maddox were on at the same time. And Jim Brown is talking about the need for economic development for African Americans in this country. And Lester Maddox says, oh yeah, well you didn't mention white people. How come it's not all people that need, right? And it became a language game. And the show collapsed. And really, if you give your students a chance to listen to this, because he's got the quotes online, and you can see how language itself gets screwed up when people manipulate it, okay? So that's it. But now, the other thing I want to just mention is that language depends on who is in the room, right? You can, if you tell a joke, and you can tell a joke in one context, but if one of the people in the room is the object of that joke, it has stopped being a joke, an in-joke, a kind of a nice, kind of a funny joke. If you are from Massachusetts, or if you are from Vermont, you tell Maine jokes, right? But if there are Mainers in if Susan Collins is in you can't tell that joke anymore. Because she will be insulted, and your doing it becomes an insulting act instead of simply a funny joke, okay? And so it's very important to remember that. Okay, so that is what we are looking at. So now I want to take you we got about 15 minutes to, and I'll go over just a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So, words of peace and truth. This is a remarkable thing. In the 18th century, to give you a little bit of the sense of the time and place, you have German Jews. They are a relatively small part of the population. But Berlin is becoming the capital of an aggressive state, and it is part of a growing imperial kind of state. And it is a country informed by Enlightenment. And so the nation state and the belief in German culture are growing apace. They are growing together. This is the time, the great figure of the Jewish Enlightenment. I mentioned before the word Haskalah, and I want to stress again, I sort of skipped over it. The word Haskalah is a biblical word, or maskil is a biblical word, that means an intelligent man. But in this case, it comes to mean not just an intelligent man, but a person who is learned specifically in the new values of the Enlightenment, and who then goes out to do it to other Jews, to teach other Jews. So the Haskalah is both inward turned, it sets up a new set of standards for what constitutes an enlightened man, and also it sets up an agenda, an educational agenda for Jews, right? To take this out to the everyday Jews. Just as Germans wanted to educate the peasants in Bavaria who spoke their own dialect, Jews want to begin to teach other Jews to speak German the way you're supposed to, because Jews speak Yiddish or Yiddish, and Yiddish is dismissed as a jargon, as a terrible, degrading thing, right? And think back, I talked before about the sense that African American phrasing is different. Think about if somebody speaks dialect, if somebody speaks with a heavy Latino accent, or if somebody uses slang words that come from the ghetto, right? And then tries to make it in the outside society. When did Obama change the register of his speech? When did he speak like the Harvard professor? When did he address an African American audience and you could hear the cadence and you could hear the melody and so forth? And these are tools that we all use, but they are implicit in this visible language, and it is crucial to realize that at that moment of contact between groups, what language you speak and how you speak it and how you master it is at the center of this. So what we are looking at is a booklet published in 1782 called Words of Peace and Truth. The title of the book comes from the scroll of Esther, which is in the Old Testament. It is the phrase that the Queen Esther and her uncle Mordecai send out a message to all their Jews with words of peace and truth. So this is a message to other Jews. It is written in Hebrew by a man named Naphtali Hertz Wesley. In Yiddish it was called Weisel, but Wesley was the way his name was done. This happens to be his tombstone, which is lying on the ground in the oldest of the Sephardic cemeteries in Hamburg. And before I cropped it, you could see my shoes in this picture. But it was a cloudy day. It was the best I could do. I should have cleaned it off. But he is a poet, an educator, a translator. It is not coincidental that his father was a wealthy financier from Copenhagen, which was at that time part of the German, Denmark was a major power in Europe at the time, and in fact Hamburg and Altona are divided between different states, and Altona, which is now just one of the suburbs of Hamburg, was Danish. But in any case, Wesley, coming from a wealthy home, becomes associated with Moses Mendelssohn, who was the major figure in the Jewish Enlightenment. We have a famous story that he goes to visit Kant. He's on business in Königsberg. He goes to visit Kant. He walks into the university classroom, and the kids see this kind of misshapen, hunchbacked little old Jew there, and they make fun of him. What the hell is that Jew doing here? And then Kant comes in, and at the end of the lecture, Mendelssohn walks down to the front, and all the students are trying to push him away, and because this is the great Herr Kant, Dr. Kant, and Professor Kant, Professor Herr Dr. Kant, and Kant says, "Ah, you're Mendelssohn," and they immediately hug and embrace and start talking. And then we have a letter from Kant to a friend saying, I didn't realize Mendelssohn was going to be there. I gave such a shitty lecture, and I'm so embarrassed. I hope that he still wants to talk to me and things like that. And of course, Jews love this letter because it shows that Mendelssohn was, valued by Kant. He also beat out Kant in an essay contest once. So that's another question. Now, in this essay, and here I just in the time, we're not going to go through a lot of it, but I have a copy of an excerpt in English that I can give any of you that want it, but it doesn't really matter. It begins. Somebody else read. Somebody read. I'm tired of my own voice. You got it.
Said the wisest of men, educate a youth in their path, he is to take literally according to his way, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22.
So he begins his phrase, said the wisest of men. Who is the wisest of men? Solomon. And this comes from Proverbs. Why does he begin with a quote from the Bible? Audience. It legitimizes. He's a preacher. Imagine every sermon you ever went to. It's in the book. And you quote from the book. So what is it? Educate a youth in the path he is to take, and even when he is old. So it's a statement about education. Yes. That education of the young is important. Keep going. Oh, I'm sorry.
It was this statement. This statement has two parts. The first, educate a youth that is one should be educated in his youth. His heart is unsullied by the vanities of the world and by the perversities of strange ideas.
Right. Okay. So it's easy. And keep going. The second part.
For when his heart is like clean and smooth.
No.
The second part. Okay. The second part, according to his way, that is according to his qualities and potential. For the disposition of men and their spiritual faculties are not the same. What is easy for one to receive and retain will be difficult for another.
right? So that's an argument for streaming, right? In other words, put kids in classes that are appropriate to them or something like that. But he begins by saying education of the young is important. Okay? So far, anything dangerous here? Anything difficult? This is a book named for a biblical phrase. It is written in what language?
Hebrew.
Hebrew it is, absolutely. So this is written in a traditional format. Now, somebody else. Somebody in the back who can read this one.
Now,
Go ahead. Please.
Now, in order
Okay.
to educate the use of Israel in the proper manner, 2 types of studies should be established. The first type is the study of human knowledge. Torah Hadam.
Yeah.
That is, those matters which earn for their possessors the title man, Adam. Since he who lacks this knowledge hardly deserves this title, as should be explained. The second type is the study of the Torah of God, that is, God's laws and teachings, matters that are above human reason, and that were made known to Moses through prophetic revelation.
Okay, and last line.
Uh,
Strong voice.
Had the Torah not come to us in this divine fashion, it would have remained hidden from even the most sagacious of men, for its contents cannot be deduced from the fixed laws of nature.
Okay. Now, here you have the crucial step. He starts out saying, hey, it says in Psalms, not in Psalms, in Proverbs, you have to educate kids, and how shall we do it? We have to educate them properly. There's a thing of appropriateness, and when they're young, we have to teach them first the Torah of man, the philosophy of man, the learning of man, and then we should get around to the learning of God. Okay? And that learning of God, that truth of God, is the hidden which otherwise, had we not received the Bible in Revelation, would have never been discovered. There are things that are subject to reason, and things that are above reason. Go ahead.
That reference you showed in Proverbs, isn't the Hebrew in that the derek, meaning that so in other words, meaning that individual, because in Jewish culture, that the individual, when they were training the child, that child was trained specifically for what they were supposed to do, whatever service, trade, or area. And so what you're saying is essentially they used aspects of what was already written in the Torah and use that as well to build their enlightenment. So their enlightenment also was kind of not just intellectual per se, but it was strongly religious. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so there's 3 or 4 things that was a very rich question, and let me say yes to all of those things, except that the idea of a predetermined path in life is not one that they would have understood. The word derech, it's true, it means path, but it's just a path, right? How you go, what your life is going to be like, right? And so forth. But you're right about all of those things and about the use of the traditional text, and he is trying to stay within the boundaries, and that is the point. We can continue this in a bit. But now, what he did was he divided knowledge into 2 parts. He said there is a human knowledge subject to reason and a suprahuman knowledge which is not subject to reason, which is above reason. Religious truth is above it. Now, hold that thought, okay? That division, right? Because Enlightenment, of course, says we know it all. And he says, no, there are 2 parts. So watch what happens. In general, somebody else. Yeah.
In general, human knowledge is comprised of etiquette, the ways of morality and good character, civility, and clear, graceful expression. These matters and their like are implanted in man's reason. He who possesses human knowledge will gain much from the poetic expression of the divine Torah and from the ways of God that are written therein. Similarly, history, geography, astronomy, and the like, which are inscribed in the mind of man as innate primary ideas, whose foundation is reason, produce truths in every matter of wisdom.
Okay, and he goes on. Now, remember what he did. He divided knowledge into two categories, human knowledge and divine knowledge. And he just defined human knowledge as,
Products of reason.
yeah, but give me some examples.
History.
Etiquette. Etiquette. We call those Eurocentric values. You have to become like them because they are the essence of being human. The Enlightenment, reason, has made men men. You see what he did? He didn't say, you are a man because you are a Jew of the holy seed of Israel and God has blessed your people with a divine reason. He didn't say you are human because you can study the Torah and the original because you've studied Hebrew and you know what it means, or you've studied the Talmud and you know Aramaic. He said you are human because you share Eurocentric values. Sounds like political correctness to me. Okay? But that's what he is buying. Next. Now, human knowledge, and here I'm just going to go quickly, is anterior to the exalted divine laws. And it's proper, therefore, that you should first become a man with the rules of etiquette and with knowledge to which the appellation human is appropriate, and then you go on to study the divine. Okay, now, because I told too many stories, and I want to get to the end, and I want to make my point, I'm going to summarize this. What he seems to do, therefore, is something absolutely radical. He, first of all, takes knowledge and divides it up into two parts. And he says what makes us human is the first part, Eurocentric values. Once you've got Eurocentric values, once you can talk to people, like in Yiddish we would say like a mensch, like a human being, like a person, if you will, like a Christian, then you can go on and learn the extra Jewish stuff. Now this would seem to be the most radical kind of abnegation of one's own culture that you can imagine.
Yeah.
Can you imagine saying, if you were an African American in this country, well, only if we talk like white men, only if we dress like white men, only if we pray like white men, only if we behave like white men, can we then go on and be African Americans? Can you imagine a woman in this day and age saying, if only I could learn to dress in pants and a suit with a tie just like men in my office and become the CEO, then I can also at home play with my children? Or can you imagine an immigrant to this country using this kind of self-abnegation? So that's what we would appear to see as enlightenment, except we would miss the point. And here is the point of my mind. In fact, first of all, he is doing something that is absolutely traditional in Judaism. It is not a function of the Enlightenment. It is a traditional function that Jews have gone through the centuries. Even the division of knowledge into human knowledge and divine knowledge is an absolute standard phrase in Jewish literary conventions. The term is used in different ways to mean different things. But what he is doing is standing up to his community and saying, guys, we all know there's two levels. There's the level of the everyday, and there's the level of divine knowledge. And not everybody is capable of divine knowledge. And by the way, divine knowledge has a place, but it is only available to the elite. And that which we share with other people is in fact the foundation of being a human. Now his agenda is clear. He wants Jews to be able to be acceptable to the outside world. He wants to make, don't forget they're a tiny minority. They're a small population. But he wants to legitimize for his own community in terms that community already understands. The distinction between two worlds of knowledge to legitimize something which Jews have already understood very well, at least for the elite that were capable of getting access to it, that getting access to the high culture of the outside society was always a valid goal, and not only was it a valid goal, but it was good for you economically or personally, and you then came back into the community with your knowledge, and you could claim dignity within your own community because you knew what those guys knew. Okay? So now, very briefly, let me just summarize and come to my punchline. The thing that is extraordinary about the Jewish Haskalah, which in most Jewish historical treatments is treated as a radical break from the past, a radical attempt to modernize, to give up on Jewish tradition, is it is not. The Haskalah is conservative politically. It is understood as a method for Jews to earn their role in the new state that is emerging. The book, by the way, is written in response to an edict by the Emperor Joseph II allowing Jews to get education and participate in society. It is linguistically conservative. It is written in Hebrew in very conservative terminologies. And conceptually, it is a call for Jews to take the knowledge that they get from the outside, come back into their own community, and re-understand, redefine Judaism in the words and with the concepts that they have learned. In other words, this is a statement by those intellectuals who have walked out of the community, who have been exposed to that wonderful world, that glittering world of enlightenment, and they come back in and say, and now I'm the king. I'm the rabbi. People say, excuse me, who are you? I'm the guy who knows enlightenment, and I can tell you what Judaism says in ways that your rabbis don't understand because they have not studied this. Intellectuals, therefore, I would argue to you, well, let me skip this. Now, I believe that these people are at the birth of what I have spent my entire life doing, which is to be a Jewish historian. Jewish historians are tricksters. You know this image of the trickster? Jung uses it. It comes from American Indian culture, the shapeshifter, the person who moves back and forth. We're looking at the phenomenon of translatio scientiae. That is, the transmission of knowledge from group to group and from place to place. And the scholar is, and this I want to stress to you, is a dislocated human being. The scholar who makes that leap is himself or herself uprooted. And he's constantly, or she is constantly changing shape to identify both with the new community where he or she is the source of knowledge about his origins, and his own or her own community where he claims legitimacy as the person who can bring the wisdom of the new world into that community. I mention here very quickly Solomon Maimon, if you have an opportunity. Solomon Maimon's autobiography is a wonderful book. It is a book of self-mockery and loathing, in which he talks about he, a Lithuanian Jew who comes to Germany and Holland and elsewhere, and at the same time that we have, you know, the Confessions of Rousseau and so forth and so on, and this belief in the creation of self, he is what we would call an ethnic comic, right? Any of you remember Chris Rock? This is just one example, right? I could think of many other characters, and I could mention Jewish comics, but you might not know them. But you remember Chris Rock? Chris Rock would stand up in front of an audience that was very often heavily white and make fun of black things. He would use dialect, he would do it. Now, what's he doing? Is he inviting these people to mock blackness? Is he a self-defeating human being? He's not. What he's doing is he is legitimating the humanity of his own community to the outside world by showing them, look, we can share a joke about this, but understand, my friends, that I know you're racist. And I am allowing you to find a way to accept difference, but grant me the dignity that I'm in charge here. And I'm the one who's telling you everything. Right? I'm the one who's leading this game here. Now that role of the ethnic comic, it's a very ambivalent, ambiguous. We now have Muslim comics. We now have Korean comics. What's her name? Margaret Cho, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we have all kinds of comics who use ethnicity as a way to make it, but they're not selling out, at least in my argument. And I mentioned here Isaac Babel, one of the great writers of the Soviet period, who was murdered by Stalin. And Babel, who has left us some wonderful stories, has one story called Odessa. And he says, I'm going to write to you about Odessa because they desecrate, they murder the Russian language there. What is he really saying? He's saying, I'm going to write to you about the Jews of Odessa. And the reason I can write about the Jews of Odessa instead of the counts of St. Petersburg and Moscow is because they are human too, even though they murder the Russian language. They have a claim on universal truth. They have a claim on universal morality that is important today as we mourn Toni Morrison, right? That accomplishment of finding your community and giving expression to it in the language of the outside, so the outside understands that there is an inner value in that. That is the supreme task of this dislocated intellectual who is jumping back and forth. Okay, so to get back to that phrase, intellectuals, I would argue, do not shape the world around them. We are all fairly ineffectual, like Orhan Pamuk's doctor who sits in his house and writes an encyclopedia that no one will read, and who really can't get along with his wife at all. And not that I'm talking about, no, but they don't reshape the world because intellectuals are ineffectual. But they do interpret change as it happens, right? They do tell us what's going on. And they give us the categories by which to understand what is happening. So what I've tried to leave you with, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea that the Enlightenment is a project or project. It is an aggressive project. It is filled with a lot of ridiculous assumptions about who is right and who is wrong, what is truth and what is not truth, what is good and what is not good. And of course it runs up against the shoals, runs up on the shoals of political interests and economic interests and ethnic interests and animosities. But at the same time, the people engaged in that process, those people are people who are helping us to understand not what the truth is, but that the truth itself is malleable, and that our job is to find the solid ground on which we can watch the process happening. We won't know the truth, but we can find firm ground to watch how other people are defining it around us. Thank you very much. You want me to go on for another 5 minutes?
Maybe if there's some burning questions.
Please.
We have our lunch very soon, but still we'd like to give you a chance to ask questions.
I was just curious about your comments about ethnic comedy, ethnic comic. If you, and you can tell me later, can give me some source material on that, because I don't see Chris Rock as doing that unless he has said in an interview explicitly. And the reason why I mention this is I do comedy work. Actually, am hired out as a comedian, and typically I'm performing in front of all white audiences, and I make the same kinds of jokes, but it has nothing to do with the things she said. So I'm just curious, did Chris Rock say in an interview that he was
I don't
doing
know.
these things?
I happen to pick him only because I happened to see him numerous times, and he was the popular guy when I was watching that kind of stuff. So I don't know that he did, but there are a lot of books on ethnic humor, right?
Right.
Usually there are books written about a particular ethnic group, and the comedians who did the ones that I've read are usually about Jews, but there are such things. So I can't give you a specific thing. But what I would say is, look, it's not. I'm not suggesting that he went out intentionally with some grand purpose. That's not what I was trying to suggest. What I'm trying to suggest is that the scholar, the writer, the speaker, the person who shapes narrative, right? The storyteller, if you will, who moves the, too often when we talk about enlightenment, we talk about it in black and white terms. That is, there is the European Enlightenment and the benighted savages, or the European aggressive SOB and the people they are destroying, right? And you know, you remember that commercial with the American Indian, the Native American, who's crying as he sees the you know, the garbage, right? Or that great commercial from years ago in New York that you don't have to be Jewish to like Levi's rye bread. That also had, I think, the same Indian guy crying or something like that. But my point is that you know, ethnicity is one of those things that has become, you know, it's choking us with its demands for authenticity, and I am a real this, that, or the other thing, or so on. The ethnic comedian who crosses that line, right? The ethnic comedian who speaks to the African American, who speaks to an all-white audience, the Jew who speaks to when Fiddler on the Roof played to non-Jewish audiences, right? You know, etc. You pick the example, right? That character is sometimes mocked or resented as somebody who is selling out, who is using his or her origins to make money and to cater to the man or whatever. My argument is that the ethnic comedian who is doing it in order to make a living, or to be funny, or because he likes telling stories, right, or whatever reason, that ethnic comedian is doing nothing different than the individual scholar, the high-ranking professor, who goes off to study or talk about his own community. You know, it was one thing when you had departments of ethnic studies, or they weren't called ethnic studies in those days, but regional studies or whatever, where somebody would go to Africa or Iran or Afghanistan to study it and come back and give you a report. But now what we have are people from those areas who come in, and that was a totally different process, and it was very difficult for American universities to get used to that. At first they didn't really know how to do it. They didn't understand how to accept this kind of study, and a lot of people said, oh, well, that's ethnic studies, we're not doing that, you know, things like that. That definition of the legitimacy of knowledge, right, is part of what I've been talking about here. And by raising the image of the ethnic comedian, what I'm trying to suggest is that scholars are doing exactly the same thing that a good ethnic comedian is doing. That is, crossing a line, but don't kid yourself. That scholar is torn between two identities, just like that ethnic comedian is. You know, they may claim objectivity, but there's no such thing as objectivity. There's only identity.
Thank you very much.